We're finally live, huh? It almost didn't go through. I had another issue come up here for some reason. It's a good thing I did a pre-check. Usually I do a check before the show, like a quick audio recording, to make sure it's working good. And when I did it this time, there was no audio. So I was like, what's going on here? I just fixed this, right? So I had to go into the settings again, and I changed it all, and I won't spend too much time here because we got to get to it. But just so you know why I'm a few minutes late, I was, again, close to just saying, I'm sorry, I can't do it. Because if you can't hear me, what's the point, right? But although it's good to see you or know you're there and have some live connection. But I was able to get it through, thanks to Jah. And of course, we also recognize the Son, the Holy Spirit, and everything, right? No Trinity in terms of the ontology, right? Ontology means your essence, your nature, right? No tri-personal being in terms of God. It's just God the Father and his sons, right? Separate spirit beings, always presented that way in the Bible. And I was thinking before I had to deal with the whole audio issue that I wanted to first bring up after saying hello to everyone. And again, thankfully I got that fixed, right? Because what we wanted to do, even though we do our own weekly show, this isn't really like a competition with Watchtower or anything, right? Because we know that the Watchtower and other groups have the bread and wine as part of the Christian celebration of Jesus' body and blood that he gave on our behalf for the forgiveness of our sins. So we know that many of us, having come from Watchtower and who may be associated with it now, that they strongly believe in the Bible, but that they believe because of their end time views, right? They believed for a long time that the biggest part of their organization is a group of people that are alive but don't partake of the bread and wine like we're going to do, because they're a great crowd of people who are going to live on into the new earth after Armageddon. This is how Watchtower views it. And so they thought that a long time ago and still do. But this is what keeps that group identity in place, the ever-presence of Armageddon, right? Because if you're the great crowd and if Armageddon's going to come any day now, well, that makes sense. Only it doesn't make sense, right? Because Great Tribulation hasn't happened yet. And in the Bible, for those of you who don't know, there's this big event. It's called the Great Tribulation, like where there's a lot of hardship, like tough times. And in the Bible, it's supposed to precede, come before the final war called Armageddon you may have heard about in the Bible. It's a real event described, and there are events that precede it. It's not something you should be terrified over. Obviously, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. But for those who are doing what we can, even though we make mistakes, if you're trying to do the right thing and you don't pretend that your mistakes are a good thing, then you really have nothing to fear. Although we do make mistakes no matter what, in ways that we may have to die in this world in order to live again. Now, whether or not we or anybody who is alive today is also alive at the point where they go into the new earth. In the Bible, when it talks about that great crowd I mentioned with Watchtower, it's from Revelation 7, but they identify it with the nations of Matthew 25, who don't know who Christ's brothers are. So there's some problems there with that whole understanding, but we're not here to really, discuss or be negative toward Watchtower tonight. We're just trying to give you understanding, so that when you hear about Jehovah's Witnesses, Watchtower, Christian Witnesses of Jah, or people who may have been, or you may be, or have been associated with Watchtower, well, this gives you just some understanding, a brief, comparative difference to what you're going to see tonight, because what we believe is that great crowd that doesn't partake of the bread and wine in Watchtower is a group of non-Christians who, during the Great Tribulation, during the time when the Bible describes what you might have heard about as the wild beast, making people put a mark on their forehead and their hand. Some say it's 666, some 616, but it basically all points to a sort of divine Messiah or Antichrist, like we elsewhere see described in the Bible. A prominent figure who leads basically an anti-Christian war as part of the devil's effort to persecute the true followers of Jesus. So this is described from Revelation 12 onward if you want more. But that group of non-Christians, the great crowd of Revelation 7 and Matthew 25, that Watchtower thinks is the majority of their people and that are helping the anointed, and they're fulfilling Matthew 25 because they're treating Christ's brothers well. Well, the nations in Matthew 25, that great crowd, are non-Christians who don't know who Christ's brothers are, right? See, unlike the great crowd in Watchtower who think they do know who they are. Either way, that fits with the whole idea also described in Revelation 7 of them washing their robes and making them white and being separate from the Israel of God, right? In the New Testament, there's a group called the Israel of God, basically all Christians. In the book of Romans, a letter that a well-known Christian named Paul, who was converted directly by Jesus from heaven in his account, wrote a letter to Roman Christians and described how, while the promise was originally made by God to Abraham and to his seed, when he chose Abraham and the Hebrews, ultimately, whom Moses led out of Egypt, the story of the Exodus, to be the people through whom God would bring this seed, all the way back into Genesis 3:15, right? Really, where everything changed because of our and spirit creatures' decision or desire to do something different, to go against the ways that God had put down for people to choose to do things right, with an explicit command not to do a certain thing, that by being misled and choosing to do things their own way, we brought sin upon mankind. It's why we die. The whole story of Jesus is really the solution to why we die. Because the cause of why we die is the disloyalty of our first parents, who, even though they were deceived by Satan, he lied to Eve and then she deceived Adam, or at least, even if he wasn't deceived, Paul says he wasn't deceived, but certainly he was probably captivated by Eve on some level. He chose to do it and he knew it was wrong, so something must have been going on, right? Something in his desire overrode his knowledge of what he should do. The one thing they had knowledge of good and bad about, right? Don't do this. They knew that was bad. Everything else, there was really no explicit command that said this is bad, right? God would have either told them later, or as they did certain things, he would have told them, don't do that again. But without knowing, by doing it without knowing it was bad, like Jesus teaches in the New Testament, there's no sin, right? Where there's no law, there's no sin. But Adam and Eve had that law of don't eat from the tree, and they did. And there's no reason why they should have. And so God had already put down the law, right? Don't eat from this tree because you're going to die. You're not supposed to know good and bad in how I read the account at this time. The trees were there, the tree of knowledge of good and bad and of life. So why were they there? Well, some groups may say just to represent certain things, but I think ultimately, like all the other fruit of the trees, they probably could have been eaten from when Adam and Eve had demonstrated they were ready, right? Very similar to what we read in Revelation from 7, where the great crowd and the 144,000 figurative Jewish Christians are described. See, I was saying in Romans, Paul writes about how that group that I was just talking about from the seed, from Genesis 3 and all this stuff, just starts coming out sometimes. But it all connects, right? You know, rather than just read text after text that most of you have already read time after time, and certainly you can read them on your own time, but we know them all pretty well. And for those of you who don't, well, I would say you should read them. But right now, we're just going to be here for about an hour, right? Up until about 8 or so, so not a long meeting. This is a special occasion. There's a lot of people familiar with Watchtower used to doing this annual celebration, this Christian ritual, once a year on the night of the Passover, like Jesus and his disciples did. Although there's no command to do it like that or in the same at the same time. He said keep doing this, which had to do with the bread and the wine and what they represent. But Some groups like Watchtower take it a little further and say, now it has to be at this time and after sundown. And I don't see anything like that in the Bible, certainly not in the New Testament letters where Paul and others talk about it or refer to it. Right? And like I was saying earlier, we have, going back to Genesis for a moment, Revelation, from Revelation 7 to 22, it talks about how a group, that great crowd of nations who treat the Christians right, because during the time of the persecution, the wild beast, 666, right? They can't eat, they can't buy, they can't sell because you have to have the mark. So this great crowd in Matthew 25 and Revelation 7 that Watchtower thinks most of its members are, but that most Christian groups don't think is in the same way that Watchtower does. Although it nevertheless does appear to be different, right? It's different from Christ's brothers in Matthew 25. It seems to be different from the 144,000 in Revelation 7, who are the New Jerusalem that descends over mankind in Revelation 21, which are the nations that have been being cured by the leaves growing from the trees on either side of the river, flowing from God and Jesus' throne. This is during the 1,000-year reign ahead, after the Great Tribulation, after Armageddon. But I was bringing this up because I said earlier how I thought Adam and Eve might have been able to eat from the tree of life and probably of knowledge of good and bad. If they had kept listening to God and doing what he said, then he may have just said, well, you've demonstrated that, you're not going to react in a negative way, right? Because the first thing they did was to feel ashamed. They knew they had done something wrong. And their reaction to it triggered an immediate awareness. Where are you? We were naked, so we're hiding. Who told you were naked, right? So it was immediately apparent. Now, in that way, too, you see, they had already become ruined. Right? They were already starting to think about their outward appearance and becoming vain. And, it immediately brought about a changed condition, the way I see it. But had they not done those things, right? Had they been faithful and said, no, we were told not to eat from it by the one who gave us everything else, and so there's no reason why we should listen to you. You seem like a nice serpent and all, but you didn't give us any of this stuff, and where have you been all this time, right? Where did you create us? What's going on here, right? A little bit of inquiry would have been a good thing. But it was a different condition, different time, so we're here. That was then. But had they been faithful, right? Just like in the 1,000 years I was describing, Revelation 21, 22, I know I'm kind of connecting a lot here, but let's just go through this with me, right? It says that people, the nations who are nice to Christ's brothers and who are good to them prior to his second coming at the resurrection, where it says, the sheep will be on his left, the goat on his right, the sheep on his right and the goats on his left, after he raises those who are dead in union with him, who are caught away to be with him, right? They're the ones who rule over the earth and part of New Jerusalem. The nations go in. But then they eventually, it says, happy are those who get access to the tree of life in the city, in New Jerusalem. Right, the paradise of God. So it seems to indicate that the nations, the great crowd, those who were good to Christ's brothers before the resurrection, after Great Tribulation, Armageddon, or during the Great Tribulation, I guess, come into new earth, get cured by the leaves, and then ultimately get to eat from the fruit of the tree, right? The tree of life. Well, if they get to eat from the tree of life, why wouldn't Adam and Eve have gotten to eat from the tree of life? And God even says, hey, we better remove them, right? So it seems to have been clearly accessible to them. It just wasn't for them to eat from at that time. They hadn't demonstrated, just like the nations who are cured after being good to Christ's brothers and who lived during the 1,000 years. They get to eat from it, right? Based on if they don't listen to Satan, right? Because we know, according to Revelation, it says he's led out at the end of the 1,000 years. He encircles New Jerusalem, all this stuff on earth, right? He gathers the nations and they're destroyed. And then the final judgment, right? So all of this, really, this whole story of Christianity, the Bible, all of it. I mean, there's a lot of historical stuff, of course, and we've talked about it. I've done videos about the opening chapters of Genesis and talked about all the periods of creation. They're often referred to as days, but the Hebrew term translated day can mean a period of time, and often does, and has to mean that in that Genesis account of creation, because it's used before there are even the things that mark a 24-hour day. So sometimes what gets in our way of being effective in communicating what the Bible teaches, it's not easy. There's a lot to it, of course, but I think it does make sense overall and can be shown to be historically accurate. Obviously, there are certain miracles and things we can't prove because we weren't there, but we have miracles all around us. We're a miracle. The idea that the things that are described in the Bible couldn't have happened is not at all reasonable based on the things that have happened, whether you believe in God or not, right? It's a miracle of evolution if it's not a miracle of God, and that's still a miracle. So, miracles are a little different, right? You're either there or you're not. And otherwise, when it comes to accurate information, we know what we've got, right? We've done videos, and I have many more coming, where we talk about biblical texts, right? Historical material preserved by the Jews several hundred years or contemporaneous with Jesus' time, the first century, but well before then, in many cases, most of the texts that I would say we've read so far that deal with the predictions about this future Messiah, this seed. That's what I was talking about with Genesis 3, right? Where right after the problems that happened with Satan, Adam and Eve, and Garden of Eden, all things we can show, at least in terms of, well, we have, of course, a explanation for Satan too, right? It's not like he was a snake. A lot of people who are detractors of the Bible depict him in that way. And yet, we have representations of gods as serpents in many, many cultures today and in times past, and it's always been a prominent part of not only non-biblical cultures, but the Bible. The Hebrews had to look up at a snake on a pole. The Bible describes Jehovah as having fiery flying serpents around his head. Satan is called the dragon, the original serpent. And as I said, these beings have represented themselves as these serpent snake gods everywhere. Then now think of this. Think of the dinosaurs. These massive reptilian type of creatures we still don't really understand at all. That's a lot of reptilian representation in the planet's creatures, right? I mean, according to scientists, millions of years of dinosaurs roaming the earth, these gigantic reptiles, right? Oh, well, maybe not they're reptiles too, right? Crocodiles go all the way back, right? We have sharks go all the way back, right? And yet they claim that all these things went extinct at different points, these near mass extinction events, and then they all re-evolved again, right? And some like big, massive creatures like crocodiles and sharks, they're all gone. I mean, they're here, but everything else is gone. It just doesn't make sense. But their timeline could be true because the periods of time in the Bible when creatures were made are not 24-hour days. So the periods of time described there could involve however long Jehovah wanted there to be these creatures there for the earth to be in the state it was. But without getting too off the subject tonight, which is really about Jesus Christ, it's important that you have an understanding of these events, right? When I refer to the seed of Genesis 3:15, it's important that you understand that when it's talking about Satan as a serpent talking to these first humans, there's a lot more going on there than you've probably ever seen in any art or probably described or discussed like we just did in relation to what really could be going on there, right? This isn't just a myth and the snake in there, what's talking, no, you have to understand the history and the context of the Bible and all these other cultures, all the other important references to serpents in the Bible, and then you will understand what happened in Genesis 3, why the seed was promised, why the Son of God came from heaven in our view to give his life in exchange for the first human who lost his and our life. So this is what's described in the Bible. It's him giving his perfect life. He's literally called the last Adam in 1 Corinthians 15:45, the equivalent of Adam. Right? Many Christians today who believe in the Trinity, they believe he was a God-man, right? That he's always been God and he was God as a man. This is not taught in the Bible. We understand, we talk with Trinitarians a lot. We understand they have their reasons for what they believe. But the Bible doesn't teach that. It teaches what I just said, that he was the last Adam. Literally, those are the words in the Bible. I'm not adding them. It never uses the word God-man to describe Jesus. It says he was in the form of a God and took the form of a man. It says he was with God in the beginning as one of the sons of God and became flesh. So it says he became lower than the angels. Hebrews 2:9. If you're a God-man, you're not lower than the angels. You're God. There's one person. That's how, and again, this can get a little complicated. This stuff is not necessary to believe. It's what we have to deal with sometimes when we deal with people who also believe in Jesus. Right? They celebrate his body and blood similar to how we do. Just in a way, maybe, and Watchtower, you could say, does it similar too, right? Christians today, and according to how we understand the New Testament, often as we come together and can, partake of the bread and the wine to show our faith in that sacrifice. See, today it's another one of those things you have to understand historically and contextually again. If you don't understand a lot more of what could be going on with Satan as the serpent, well, similarly, if you don't understand the history and the different reasons why groups committed sacrifices, whether animals or human, in the Bible, Jehovah only promoted animal sacrifices and atonement for their sins. I know some people like to misinterpret texts, a couple texts that I'll get to another time, but we're not going to get off on too many disputed issues now. Just know that the reason for animal sacrifices in the Old Testament was so that the Israelites or Hebrews could have a relationship with God and anyone else, like with Abraham before them, so that he could deal with them in their condition, our condition today. I mean, even though it has its moments, right? Maybe you have a family where you don't see a lot of like really bad things, but you know they're out there, right? Things happen in this world that are just they don't seem right. Well, the consequence of that is a loss of the kind of relationship that Adam had with God. That's why he was thrown out of the garden, whereas before he was talking directly with God. And then when God started dealing with Moses, right, he had to have these laws, these requirements, and then these led to the development of this body for the Messiah to be the seed and to ultimately restore everything in a way that is according to God's will. So in dealing with Satan is essentially saying, as he's described in Job. Remember, when we read about Satan in the Bible, it's another, again, like the serpent, but different. We often, I think of him as just this very, very evil looking and acting person. While there may be something to that, it's important also you understand he is a son of God, okay? And as a son of God, he has access, or did, right? I'm talking about Job and before Jesus' resurrection, had access to God and had authority and ability to do things like he did in Eden that we don't understand, right? He was given authority, in fact, in Job to do a lot of stuff. We never really think about why that is, do we? because he's a son of God. So God deals with his sons as he chooses to do. And that's why when we do things that are bad, he could also deal with us. But obviously the spirit's on another level, although even Satan is eventually being held accountable, right? They're not above being punished. But when it comes to us, right, we're in this sort of death condition where we live, we can grow, we can have a good life, but we eventually die because of what happened. Our faith in Jesus replaces the kind of sacrifices that had to be made and that might still have had to be made if we were going to have, even in a dying condition, if we were going to have a relationship with God. See, in the Old Testament times, in the ancient world, sacrifices were basically what was valuable to you, and it was valuable to God. The life that God gave to that creature, when it dies, when it dies, it goes back to God. The Bible says that the spirit returns to the God who gave it. So something returns to God when something dies in that way. And whether you believe God originally intended anything to die, humans or animals, at the point where we are past Eden, animals are not only an asset or a thing of value that you would give in exchange for something, in this case to appease God by showing you, realize you're doing things that are wrong, and he's letting you. And you're giving up something, you're sacrificing something to show him you accept that. You accept that arrangement. And this spirit that is in the sacrificed animal returns to God. Animals, it's temporary. It's not meant to be anything other than what would normally happen as part of a eating or cultural process using animals for clothing, tools, and different things. Not humans. The human part involving Jesus has to do with the equation of Adam. God did not force Jesus to come. There's nothing in the New Testament, even all the way to the end, the night he's being killed, like we're celebrating right now. There's nothing that suggests God forced him to do all this. There's really everything that suggests that everyone who heard and observed what happened and wrote it down understood that Jesus wanted to do this, at least until the very end when it became so humiliating. And I don't think any one of us would be wanting to go through the final part of what he did. I'm pretty sure about that. So that aside, and even then he did it, right? You see, not wanting to do something isn't in itself a sin. In fact, Jesus gives an illustration, doesn't he? Where someone says they're not going to do something, the other person says they will do something. The one who says they will doesn't do it the way Jesus wants, and the other one who says they weren't going to do it ends up doing it. So it's really what you end up doing, isn't it? Maybe at one time you said or thought something, it was wrong, right? Like we thought with Watchtower. We thought we were doing the right thing by not partaking of the bread and wine. And we understand Watchtower. We kind of defined your view already. Many of us are familiar with what you do. We don't agree. We think you're making a mistake, a big mistake, but people get to choose, right? This mistake of not partaking of the bread and wine because you think you're a group of people, the great crowd, who's not here yet, that's a big one. But we're not going to force you to do anything either. And so the Son came and willingly gave his life. That's why it's so important, right? Everything in the book of Revelation and even in books like Philippians 2, Hebrews 1, they all talk about 1 Corinthians 15. They all talk about him conquering, right? Dying first. And that's what triggers all this other stuff, all this position and authority and power. It's him doing what God wanted him to do so that he could then give him everything he wanted. Because otherwise they would have had to have lived with a world like this that continuously reproduced sin in ways that ultimately would probably have destroyed us, since we're not too far from that right now. Although, either way, it's important, I think, that we focus ultimately on what it is we're about. And that's about, in our view, three things. Praising the God of the Bible, the one God, the Father, Jehovah, Jah. I believe his fullest name is actually Yahweh. I've written about it and done videos about it, but I understand it's not something you're too familiar with. That's why I often use the form Jehovah. That's more like Jehovah, which is not so far off that you can't use it as an anglicized name of God. I just prefer Jehovah because it's closer to Yahweh. And also I hyphenate the final two letters, the A and the H, in case you just want to say, like I think is probably correct, Ja'ol or Ya'ol. So if you see it that way, you'll understand more of what I'm talking about. And I don't want to get too much off into why I believe that it's Ya'ol. The simplest thing to remember is I believe the last letter of the tetragrammaton, the A part of the He or the H, what you might see as the H, is what was known as a vowel marker. Sometimes consonants were used to mark vowels when they didn't have the pointed text. And I think that's what that is. And I think the evidence, the best available evidence we have over a long period of time, points us to this. But we use Jah primarily, right? Christian Witnesses of Jah, because it helps us avoid all that, because it's pretty much indisputable, right? It's not disputed unless people want to take issue with the J, right? You get people sometimes who criticize Jehovah's Witnesses or us because we use the J letter for the divine name. When they'll use the J for Jesus, Jeremiah, Joseph, James, none of those are how those were pronounced in the Bible, Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. And yet they get all lost into this anglicization of the divine name. It's really strange, actually. But I speak English primarily, and so I'm going to use anglicized terms. God's the one who separated the languages at the Tower of Babel, a historical event, and place, by the way, and coincides with all the available evidence we have that shows where language originated and when it originated, right? It's not like, the way you think of people who think of evolution, all these thousands of years and tens of thousands of years of humans, and yet language, we only have evidence of written language, not paintings and certain glyphs. Evidence of written language like cuneiform, 45 to 5,000 years ago, if that. It's unbelievable. And that's exactly when the Bible basically describes the separation of languages in the area of Sumer, Mesopotamia, right? Babylon, as they descended after the ark. And we have so much evidence showing the flood is a real historical event. Take a look at some of our videos. I've got much more to come. But the Bible is loaded with stuff. It's loaded with unbelievable wisdom in the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, right? Pretty much everything Jesus says, the wisdom of God, right? Personified, not his attribute. There's a difference there. And I think you would do yourself well to be familiar with the Bible. Sometimes you can run into verses, where people say, oh, it should be translated this way or that way, or maybe it doesn't make sense to you. That might happen every now and then. I'm willing to say, having studied the Bible for quite a while, over 3 decades, about 3.5, and I was raised around it. you're going to find most of the Bible is pretty clear. I mean, there's some issues, like I was saying, the divine name, that's a problem, right? Most Bibles don't have that in the Old or New Testament. And the ones that have it often use Yahweh. And while the Yah part, like Jah, Jehovah, Jah, that part's correct. The way doesn't have any evidence supporting it. It has some, people make some arguments related to certain linguistic factors, but that aren't, in my opinion, credible, and they conflict with all the other evidence that is far superior, that involve representations of how to pronounce the divine name by Greek writers, historians like Diodorus, and many others, even in copies of biblical texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Leviticus B, uses a pronounceable form of the divine name in the Old Testament text. Yahweh is how it's represented. So when we get that kind of evidence and representation that basically tells us, oh, that's how they were saying it. It's right there. It's a pronounceable form, iota, alpha, omega. I believe then that, and then all the other things that I talk about in my books and my writings, it's important to have a decent understanding of the divine name, because you're going to see Lord. And even there, in many Bibles, like the New International Version, the NIV, it's so inconsistent and terrible. You read a text like Psalm 110:1, and then you read its quotation in Acts 2:32 through 36. I mean, no wonder some people believe in Trinity, right? I mean, you come away from those things, you won't know what to believe, because it's totally different from the actual text that's being translated. And yet, in the Old and New Testament, Psalm 110:1, Acts 2:32 through 36, we get this well-known Bible that completely breaks down and isn't even consistent in its use of Lord. Take a look at it. You'll be blown away. So while you may have some things like that, again, those things are not like every page of the Bible. And you can simply note texts that seem a little difficult, or maybe someone said should be translated differently. Well, make a note of that and make a little list of texts you got to do some research about. It's not that big a deal. And you should be able to come up with enough information probably to see both sides, and then your overall understanding of the issue should help you to decide. Now, you have other things that happen at times when you're talking with some people, right? Like with Watchtower, as we were discussing, they're going to tell you the bread and wine, only the anointed, and only the 144,000 referenced in Revelation 7 and 14. And that's the Christians of the New Testament. And then after the first century, basically, and some in between, that process of selecting the 144,000 began again in 1914, 1919. Even though some people who lived before then, like Russell, were also part of that group, which would be true of some in the medieval period too. But it just seems to us that Watchtower is making an unnecessary separation. The Bible over and over again describes all Christians as spiritual Jews. As I was saying earlier, Paul wrote to the Romans about how the Jews, the people to whom the promises were made, right, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to the Hebrews, and through Moses and the law, those people, the ones who rejected Jesus, they ultimately rejected him. And so Jesus said, your house is abandoned to you. That doesn't mean individual Jews can't become Christian. And Paul says that that original tree is saved, right? The tree, the root of the Jewish people and the promises made to them is saved by the number of the Gentiles that come in and fill it up. They're grafted. Grafting means like you can take a piece of another tree and graft it, like make it a part of an existing tree. That's how the Bible in the book of Romans describes the salvation given to the Jews, but which would extend to all people, right? Because the Bible ultimately talks about everybody rising up and being judged according to their deeds. It doesn't mean you can earn your salvation, but it means that God and Jesus are going to look at the things you did and whether or not you did enough in their view to receive life. And so when we talk about these things with respect to Jesus and the Bible, I think it can actually be quite simple. I think we often get involved in discussions about text and we make it seem harder than it is. But it's really just about working together and understanding where we come from, why we sometimes make mistakes, right? Why sometimes bad things happen. Well, the Bible speaks of the seed of the righteous and the seed of the wicked one. So not all humans are going to choose the right thing, just like Adam and Eve or others, right? And Adam and Eve were described super wickedly. It was not good, and maybe wicked, of course, but right, we have people like Cain who murdered Abel, right? So there's this progression of sin and evil that can happen. And it can become a really big problem. We have cities like Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, right? We can see how that happens today and how it totally ruins societies and cultures. Tries to change your gender, right? I mean, it gets really weird sometimes. Well, all of these things God is tolerating. He's tolerating that, and he has been tolerating that for several thousand years from mankind. So the people he chose were the seed of Abraham. Everyone else outside of that, all the other nations, were assigned, according to what the Bible teaches in the book of Deuteronomy and in Daniel and elsewhere, were assigned to the sons of God, the different spirit princes of the nations, and Satan himself even being called the ruler of the world. Not anymore in our view. We believe since Jesus was resurrected, he's now the ruler of the kings of the earth. He has all authority and power. Matthew 28, Revelation 1:5. So Satan has lost that. He has been thrown down. He only has a short time left, relatively speaking. But before that time, right, all these other nations and groups were given to the sons of God as their peoples until the Messiah could be born. Remember, none of this was supposed to be like this. It could have been like this if the choices that were made, but it wasn't supposed to be like this, with everybody at enmity and war and dying all the time and all these terrible things. No, the good parts of life were supposed to be permanent. Those were supposed to spread throughout the earth. But because the badness has been spreading, God has had to tolerate us. And we simply are the product of our own choices. Sometimes bad people do affect us directly. That's true, right? So we see seemingly good people hurt by bad people, but we don't really know who is who and what happened and what could have happened. And if the person who was attacked or killed by the bad person, had they lived, what would have happened? There's so much we don't know. And we really can't say anybody is deserving of anything because we don't know them well enough, or even if they were so young not to really have done anything. Again, the idea that God would have us in the very condition that you would be able to reflect on why something happens, but not be able to make it right again is strange to me. It seems like he's simply allowing people to make choices. And if people are hurt along the way who shouldn't have been hurt, but for those bad choices, then he will easily be able to remedy that during the time when people aren't being judged for those very same evil acts. You see, you can't have a judgment without something to judge. And we are in a period of judgment right now and have been since the beginning. So we cannot expect there not to be something to judge, right? It defeats the whole argument of why does God permit evil? Well, he's simply allowing us to make choices to be judged. So he either would have to force us, prevent us from even thinking about doing something evil, which would restrict our ability to be autonomous, right? to choose it all. And so that's not his image, right? We would be a different type of creature. We're literally in his image, responsibility and all. And if our desire leads us to make the wrong choice, then like Satan, we get the consequences, don't we? If we're literally aware of something we should do and do the exact opposite or something totally different, who's responsible, right? Unless someone's holding a gun to our head or forcing us to do something. As we talked about, God doesn't even force Jesus. We just know this is the right thing to do. You can see the effects on people, right? You can see the effects on people, like when someone attacks them or hurts them. It's something that in your spirit tells you that's wrong. That if that happened to you, that would be bad. And that's why using the golden rule helps you identify that. Now, a lot of people don't care about the golden rule. Do unto others as you want them to do to you. They want to do what they want to do, and they don't care what it does to you. So we have to be able to identify that as well. As much as we might want the world to be a better place right now and reflect the will of God so we can all get along and have a better life, the reality of our life right now is that it's filled with judgment. And we're judged not only by God and Jesus ultimately, but by people every day, right? Watchtower judges us because we're doing this and not with them. And so you know what I'm saying? So, and we don't want to hate them for that. We don't want to think evil of them, right? It may not be nice. And at times we might feel like they're being mean to us. And so we don't like that, of course. But it's not going to help. It's not going to help to be this happens, right? We deal with people who are difficult, who trigger us because they bother us, right? That just is the way it is sometimes. But we can learn to identify the people that bother us like that and just ignore them to the extent that it's possible. And then when it comes to people who we think might be close enough to what we are to want to associate, right? Like Watchtower, don't be too surprised when they just completely reject you right now. They're going through a tough period, right? Their leadership is in crisis, their doctrine's in crisis, but there's a lot of good people there, good in the sense that I think they more often than not, like Joseph, Potiphar's wife, right? No one's perfect, no one's good in that sense, but I think there are people who want to do good and see good things done versus bad, versus evil, versus pain, right? Death. So, to the extent that we can focus on people like that, that will make our life a lot better. And if we at times just have to deal with people who question our views or beliefs or who maybe are related to us or know us or family members, and they're part of another group and they're being unnecessarily mean to us. The best way I think we can deal with that kind of situation, where if we're not in agreement with certain people like Trinity or Watchtower on Great Crowd, Anointed, Governing Body, is to just try not to let them get to you too much and continue to be the very thing they don't think you can be. Watchtower doesn't think anybody but them could possibly be doing what we're doing and be approved by God. Trinitarians think we got to believe in Trinity and all this other tradition and stuff in order to do what we're doing. But we know that to do what we're doing requires that we have a love for God, a recognition and appreciation for Jesus, a love for him, of course, too. But recognition, appreciation, understanding the historicity, right? Remember things I said earlier. This is not just some story. I know sometimes it can be seen like that and presented by many as such, but again, historicity. Tell me another religious text or story that has even one text like the type of texts we have that were written 100 or more years before Jesus was born, and that describe in detail the very things separate accounts describe being done to him during a time of Roman occupation, and where Roman historians like Tacitus describe Jesus and those who followed him and his execution. It's certainly unique. I think certainly worthy of anyone's attention, whether you agree that he's the Son of God and the sent forth Savior or not. But we do. We believe he is. We accept who we are, just Christians, people who are trying to do the best we can with God's Spirit and who are not lying to other people about chronology and when the end is going to come, right? Trying to scare the death out of everyone. No, you should have a healthy fear of knowing that we're all ultimately going to be judged according to what we do and say. That doesn't mean that every single little thing is going to add up and condemn you on Judgment Day. Right? We all make mistakes. But what are you trying to do? What is your desire? Do you feel bad after you make a mistake? Okay, well, that's good. Then don't worry about it. You made a mistake, you feel bad, move on. Very important for us to move on. As Christians, as people who want to do what's good, very hard for us to move on. Because our mistakes stand out to us more because we're trying to do what's right. Whereas evil people, they're not trying to do anything. They don't care. Now, later on, when they have a change of heart, all that'll come back on them, right? Oh my God, I can't believe what I did. Right, so we're dealing with it more difficultly as it's like always with us. For them, it like all comes at once, and then they have this big change if they do. Either way, move on, right? Don't let anything hold you back. Try to be a good person. Do the best you can. You usually won't go wrong with that. But I will say this. Don't let other people take advantage of you. You can tell when someone is trying to help you and when someone is not. And sometimes people will lie to you. And you might not see it. And you might trust the wrong person. Move on. Right? You might be in Watchtower right now and you might think, I can't believe what's going on. Well, do you see what's happened? Do you see the right way to go forward from here? Go that way and move on. Don't be hateful. You don't have to be mean. In fact, I think it's probably better, even though I understand some people, whether it's Watchtower or others, if you've been damaged by a certain group, I understand how it could be much harder, more difficult to move on. In Christianity, though, our whole thing is being forgiven and asking God and Jesus, hey, can we just move? I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I put faith in the ransom of Jesus and in his blood. Right? So we're asking for that, right? We want that. Well, we have to give it to others too. Even though groups like Watchtower and Trinity, Catholic Pride, they condemn us, right? For not believing in what they want us to believe, even though what we believe, in one God the Father, is actually explicitly taught in the Bible, right? Don't trust humans, explicitly taught in the Bible. Right? Don't write about dates and times, seasons. It's explicit. So we're not asking anybody, Watchtower or Trinity, to do something that's not in the Bible. Yeah, we disagree and we understand. We're not going to solve all of our problems and we'll still have some issues. I think we can move on from some stuff. And I'm hoping that many people who are in the Watchtower right now, who are celebrating the memorial, will eventually come to realize that you can continue to do everything that's explicitly taught in the Bible without having to also defend everything the Watchtower is teaching you and others that's not in the Bible. Unfortunately, like with the Trinitarians many times, they require us to believe things that are not in the Bible. They think they're consistent with the Bible. We can see they're not. So we're not going to do it. It'd be easy for us to do it, right? We could just go back into Watchtower, go into any kind of Trinitarian church and say, hey, Trinity, right? 1914, let's go, right? We just can't do that, can we? This is something that won't let us do that. We choose the path that has discomfort because ultimately it's going to give us peace of mind, right? It is the right thing. And even though it's hard to do, if you really believe it's the right thing to do, then that's what you should do. Don't be rash. Don't cause yourself unnecessary pain. But you might be doing that already if you're teaching the wrong things. So let's just hope for the best in everything, right? Love hopes all things, believes all things, endures. Love never fails. We don't give up on anyone. Sam, are you out there? We're not going to quit on anyone. But if they quit on themselves, well, we're not going to go worrying about another person's life and destroy our own at the same time, are we? That would be foolish. People get to choose. Sometimes our friends, our family, others, they're going to choose something we don't want them to choose. Guess what? They get to choose. And that doesn't mean we have to be mean to them or shun them or hate them like they may do to us. Respect their choice. Be the best person you can be. Be what you claim is correct. Show them you can do this. Kind of ties in with what I was saying earlier. The best thing we can do, although we sometimes have to debate or argue with people standing for the truth, I am convinced the absolute best thing we can do to help all these other people with these different religions and what we think might be correct is to just do it ourselves. Right? Just keep living the way that we can see is correct. Keep receiving the blessings that come from God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And they'll keep seeing that. And while they may not agree or like it for a while, eventually they're going to see that you are doing this. That you actually can serve Jehovah, the God of the Bible, and follow his son and live the golden rule without having to do every single thing all these other groups tell you have to do. And that, yes, you can partake of the bread and the wine as a Christian, right? Watchtower tends to think only about this teaching of the organization that, they're going to rule as kings. And they're going to rule as kings, and that is true. That's what the Bible describes. But, have you thought much about what it means to rule as a king? What did Jesus do? You address me, teacher and Lord, he said. And yet look at what I'm doing. The greatest among you must be your servant. They viewed him, he was the one who was going to be king, right? He's literally the Messiah to be king. Enthroned at God's right hand. That's what he does. It just seems like in Watchtower sometimes they have a different view of all that. I wonder if you really think of being kings as Christians, whether your view should be more like washing people's feet, or comforting the sick and the elderly, or being honest, teaching the truth, not judging other people just because they don't do every single thing that you choose to do. And as far as what we choose to do, we partake of his body by means of the bread. And his blood by means of the wine. We try to do this every time we come together, usually every Saturday, although occasionally it changes. If you want to know for sure, just subscribe, hit notifications, and you'll be updated. Excuse me. But we do it to proclaim the coming of Jesus and our faith in him. We're not doing it to make ourselves better than other people, like we're this special group that if you don't listen to, you're finished, Yeah, we think we have good advice. I mean, we we believe we're Christians teaching the truth, but we know who we are. We're sinners too. You're not supposed to trust anyone 100%. And we know that being kings means being the Lord. Involving him doing these lowly things show how great he was. Let's be those kinds of kings. And let's show the people in the Watchtower they can be those kinds of kings too. That the Bible promises a new heavens and a new earth. And in these righteousness is to dwell. It's very clear there are going to be people on the earth for the 1,000 years and after. But Christians rule with Christ in the sense we were just talking about, to help those people. To help bring them back into a state where they've been cured and can ultimately, hopefully, eat from the tree that is in the paradise of God, like we do. And resist the wicked one. So I thank you all for joining me. We are going to do this probably every year, not as a competition to Watchtower, but so that you have a place you can come in case, because I know many of us who were once with Watchtower, it's a very big event. And it can kind of wear on you a little when you don't participate to some extent on this very day or night, because you're just so used to it in the Watchtower. And there's no reason why we can't do it tonight. Jesus did it on this night. So the Bible doesn't teach against it. It just doesn't teach that you should only and can only do it on this one occasion. But I do thank you for joining me on this special occasion. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. I'll be back this weekend, Saturday and Sunday. And so until then, I wish the best for you and your families, and may Jah bless you. In Jesus' name.